Hello, my name is Emily, and I'm a 34-year-old woman grappling with the profound loss of my father to cancer. My dad was my hero and my closest confidant throughout my childhood. He imparted wisdom and skills that I cherish deeply. My bond with him was so strong that it's hard to convey the magnitude of my sorrow since his passing, a sorrow that, bewilderingly, my then-husband, Richard, couldn't seem to fathom. Richard and I crossed paths through a friend and hit it off on a blind date, sharing laughs and interests seamlessly. It wasn't long before we were inseparable, and after dating for 3 years, we decided to get married. We dreamt of starting a family, but agreed to wait until we felt financially stable. Our first big purchase as a couple was a cozy 3-bedroom house, complete with a living room, kitchen, dining area, and 3 bathrooms. It was a modest space, but it was ours, and building that home together remains one of my proudest achievements. The tranquility of our life was shattered the day I received a frantic call from my mom, informing me that my dad had collapsed and was being rushed to the hospital. I was beside myself with worry, dropping everything to be by his side. The hospital became a blur of tests and tension as doctors worked to diagnose his condition. After 3 agonizing days, the devastating news came. My father had aggressive pancreatic cancer. My world crumbled that day, and the pain and chaos that followed were indescribable. Dad's battle with cancer confined him to the hospital for 4 months, and I was there as much as possible. Richard, however, struggled with my absence. "You're never home anymore," he complained. But how could I be anywhere else when my father was fighting for his life in the hospital? The gravity of my dad's illness seemed lost on Richard, and I couldn't fathom his inability to understand why I needed to be with my father during such a critical time. Richard expressed his concern, suggesting that my constant presence might not be beneficial for my father's recovery. Being there all the time won't heal him. "Maybe give him some space to rest," he said, hinting that my frequent visits could be more disruptive than supportive. I was taken aback. "Are you saying I'm making things worse?" I asked. Richard clarified, saying if he were in my dad's shoes, constant visits might feel overwhelming. I was adamant that I hadn't been bothering my father at all, and urged Richard to be upfront about his real issue. He confessed, "I just miss having you around. We hardly spend any time together anymore." I acknowledged his feelings, agreeing that I too missed our moments together. I promised to find a balance, assuring him I'd space out my visits once I knew my dad's health was more stable. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that we received news of my dad's condition stabilizing. I started visiting every other day, which Richard still wasn't thrilled about, but I felt he needed to understand. Then, one day at work, a call from my mom made my heart skip a beat. Bracing for anything, I answered. "Hey, honey," she began, her voice heavy with worry. "I've just come from seeing your dad, and it's not good news." My heart sank. "The doctors say he has about 1 more month," she choked out. The world around me seemed to freeze. My father, ever the optimist, was facing his limited time with a smile, but the thought of losing him was unbearable. My mom mentioned he wanted to ask me something personally, a request he reserved for our next visit. I was in a daze, barely able to process the rest of my workday. My boss noticed my distress and, after hearing what was happening, kindly let me leave early. Grateful, I rushed to the hospital, eager yet dreading to learn what my dad wanted to discuss. This moment, sharing the pain with my family and facing the reality of my dad's condition, was one of the toughest yet most poignant parts of our journey together. As I approached the hospital, the weight of my father's situation hit me all at once. My mom's call had left me in a fog of disbelief, but arriving at the hospital snapped everything into stark reality. I sat in my car for a moment, allowing myself to cry. I knew my dad would have hated to see me upset, so I let those tears out before facing him, trying to brace myself for what lay ahead. Stepping through the hospital's familiar corridors felt surreal, each step echoing with the gravity of my dad's illness. Upon reaching his room, my mom enveloped me in a deep, comforting hug. We clung to each other, finding solace in our shared sorrow before I mustered the courage to see my dad. He looked frail, a shadow of his former self, yet his eyes sparkled with the same warmth and love as they always had at the sight of me. "Hey, Bun," he greeted, his voice carrying a mix of joy and fatigue. "Long time no see," he joked, trying to lighten the mood despite the circumstances. I tried to keep the conversation light, but the elephant in the room was impossible to ignore. Dad brought up his diagnosis, revealing that he wished he could have been the one to tell me about his limited time left. It was a conversation no one ever wants to have, filled with unsaid feelings and the harsh reality of our situation. Then he shared his request. He wanted to spend his remaining days surrounded by family, asking if he could move in with me and my mom. The thought was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. I agreed in principle, but mentioned I'd need to discuss it with Richard, wanting to ensure we were all on the same page. The hours spent with my parents that day were a bittersweet mix of laughter and poignant conversations, a precious time I knew we wouldn't have much more of. Leaving the hospital, I was torn between the joy of having had this time together and the profound sadness of knowing these moments were fleeting. It was an emotional whirlwind, leaving me feeling both shattered and grateful for the time we still had together. After leaving the hospital, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I struggled to find peace with the contrasting feelings of cherished moments with my dad and the looming shadow of his departure. It was late, around 10 p.m., when I finally got home. Richard was there, pacing anxiously in the living room. His initial worry quickly shifted to frustration upon seeing me. "Where have you been?" he demanded, mentioning his attempts to contact me since 5 p.m. I explained, apologetically, that I had been with my dad, sharing the devastating news we had received about his limited time left. Richard's demeanor softened immediately, regret washing over him for his earlier anger. He apologized, realizing the gravity of what I was facing. We then moved on to discuss my dad's request to spend his final days with us, a topic I approached delicately, knowing it required Richard's agreement. However, Richard's reaction was unexpectedly harsh. He objected, pointing out my dad's wealth and the ample space in his own home, questioning why he would need to intrude on our smaller living space, especially with potential medical equipment. His lack of empathy stunned me. Richard even suggested that if my dad wanted to stay with us, he should have contributed financially to our household. His words were like a slap in the face, revealing a side of him I hadn't fully recognized before. The insensitivity and materialistic viewpoint he expressed were alienating and deeply hurtful. Unable to process Richard's harsh stance and feeling betrayed by his lack of support, I gathered my things and left for my parents' house. The drive was a blur, my mind racing with questions about Richard's true feelings and the lack of empathy he had shown not just towards my dad's situation, but towards me as well. It dawned on me that Richard's reaction might reflect deeper issues in our relationship, highlighting a disconnect in values and understanding. My resolve to stand independent of my dad's wealth, a principle I had held since college, was now, ironically, a point of contention in a moment that called for compassion and unity. Forging a life without leaning on my father's wealth was a path I chose proudly, a sentiment deeply valued by my family and myself. Despite understanding this, Richard harbored an unreasonable bitterness towards my parents, which never made sense to me. If frustration was justified, it should have been directed at me. The day's turmoil left my thoughts scattered, driving me to seek refuge in the quiet of my parents' house, where I succumbed to exhaustion on the couch. The next day, clad in the previous day's attire and feeling disheveled, I managed to navigate through work only to hurry back to the hospital. My appearance must have signaled alarms for my parents, who immediately sensed turmoil beneath my worn facade. I avoided their probing eyes until the unavoidable concern for my well-being surfaced. My father, with a hint of his enduring humor, broke the ice by questioning my tousled state as if I had been caught in a storm. I tried to brush off their concern, but the truth of my domestic discord inevitably came out during our conversation. The concern was evident when my father, despite grappling with his mortality, expressed worry over the impact his request to stay with us might have on my marriage. I assured him, with a heavy heart, that I was prepared to face whatever consequences might arise from choosing to prioritize his final wish over my marital harmony. I resolved to have one final discussion with Richard about my dad's request, determined that if he remained unsympathetic, it would signify the end of our journey together. My conviction was clear. A marriage devoid of empathy, especially during such a testing time, held no value to me. This decision wasn't made lightly, but came from a place of deep introspection amidst the grief and anxiety shadowing my father's declining health. Returning home to an empty house, I seized the moment of solitude to gather my thoughts, preparing for the pivotal conversation ahead with Richard. This quiet before the storm offered me a chance to reflect on the values and principles that defined me, standing firm in the face of impending change. Taking a moment to gather my thoughts and emotions, I prepared for a significant conversation with Richard. It struck me as profoundly unsettling that, despite his initial panic about my whereabouts, Richard hadn't reached out after I had left in distress. This lack of concern on his part made me reconsider our situation deeply. Resolved to address the matter head-on, I was ready to express my feelings, albeit with a hint of frustration. The possibility of divorce loomed over my head, a thought made slightly less daunting knowing my best friend's profession in divorce law. Richard returned home 3 hours later. During his absence, I attempted to bridge the gap, reaching out through calls and texts only to be met with silence. My worry peaked until he finally appeared, seemingly indifferent, and headed straight for the shower without acknowledging me. Determined to have our discussion, I waited for him in the bedroom, ready to confront the issues at hand. When Richard attempted to leave the room post-shower, I intervened, seeking to engage in a much-needed dialogue. His defensive stance immediately put me on edge, questioning my intentions as if bracing for another conflict. I explained, emphasizing the pain his earlier words had caused and the importance of discussing my father's request once more. Richard remained stubborn, reiterating his refusal to reconsider. His argument centered on the lack of space in our home, a point I countered by reminding him of the spare bedroom that could easily accommodate my parents. His plans to convert this space into an office, he argued, couldn't be postponed, even for a mere 2 months. This stance of his suggested an underlying resentment towards my father, possibly stemming from financial matters, a tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of our relationship. This conversation was a revealing moment, highlighting the deep fissures between us, not just in our living situation, but in our values and priorities. The impasse we had reached spoke volumes, pushing me to reflect on the sustainability of our relationship in the face of such fundamental disagreements. From the outset, I had made a point of independence, refusing my father's financial assistance with a sense of pride, a decision supported by both my parents and me. Yet, Richard's perspective seemed fixated on the hypothetical ease we might have enjoyed with that help, overlooking the effort I too put into our life together. His adamant refusal to welcome my parents temporarily into our home, despite the circumstances, pushed me to decide to stay with my family during my father's final days. Richard's indifference in the face of my departure highlighted a chasm between us that I hadn't fully appreciated before. That night alone, realization dawned on me. The man I had married had become unrecognizable, his actions now painting him in a light far removed from the love we once shared. Overwhelmed, I found sleep elusive, tears my only solace. By morning, resolve had taken the place of sorrow. I informed my work of my absence, packed my belongings, and headed to the hospital to share the unfolding drama with my parents. They were understandably upset with Richard's stance, but were comforted by my choice to prioritize family. While preparing to bring my father home for his final days, I was struck by his guilt over the strain on my marriage. I reassured him that the fault lay not with him, but with the unyielding nature of Richard's heart. In those months, as my father's health waned, my commitment to him remained unwavering, a contrast to the sparse and uninvolved communications from Richard. The time spent with my father in his twilight was filled with laughter, reminiscence, and shared joy, a precious respite from the looming sorrow of his decline. As he passed, the grief was profound, yet it cemented my resolve to begin anew, free from the confines of a marriage marred by insensitivity and disregard. Returning to the home I shared with Richard, to inform him of my father's passing, and to confront the end of our marriage, I was met with a stark reminder of the depth of our divide. Richard's superficial condolences did nothing to bridge the gap his actions had created. His dismissal of my father's final wish and his callousness in the face of my grief underscored the necessity of the path I had chosen. In that moment, the decision to divorce, once fraught with uncertainty, became a clear step towards reclaiming my independence and honoring the memory of my father, whose love and lessons would forever guide me. During a time of deep sorrow, Richard's reaction to my inheritance was astonishingly insensitive. He saw my father's bequest of $6 million not as a final gesture of love, but as a boon for our collective future, proposing plans for the money as though it was a shared windfall. This only solidified my decision to end our marriage, a choice that Richard met with disbelief and selfish protests. Despite his attempts to reason with me, I sought comfort with my mother, leaving behind a relationship that had revealed its true, unkind nature. The funeral for my father was a poignant reminder of the love and respect he commanded throughout his life, providing a glimmer of warmth in the chill of grief. It also became a moment of reconnection with family, a silver lining in those dark clouds. The subsequent months, however, were marred by legal battles, as Richard refused to accept the divorce gracefully, even going so far as to claim a share of my inheritance. Fortunately, my father's foresight and clear will left no room for Richard's claims, ensuring I remained the sole inheritor. Following the resolution of our legal disputes, and with Richard forced to sell his share of our home to me, I focused on beginning anew. Renovating the house for rental became not just a project, but a metaphor for rebuilding my life. Living with my mother, we supported each other through our grief, gradually rediscovering joy and laughter. It's been about 8 months since these events unfolded, and life is beginning to show signs of promise once more. The inheritance has provided financial security, but I'm determined to stand on my own, valuing hard work over easy wealth. So much has changed in less than a year, leaving me both reflective and hopeful about what the future holds.